The sound was so small it could have been mistaken for the creak of cooling metal, a thin, broken thread of crying, half a breath long, swallowed by the wind before it could finish itself. Keanu Reeves was sitting in the cab of an old blue Ford F-150 at a gravel pull-off just past the boarded-up Sinclair station on Pine Knot Avenue, watching the snow settle on the windshield with both hands wrapped around a thermos cup of black coffee. He had stopped because the road ahead had started to glaze under the powder and the instinct in his chest had told him to wait. He set the cup down on the dashboard. He sat very still. The wind moved through the chain-link fence behind the dumpsters. The pickup's engine ticked as it cooled. A snowplow grumbled somewhere far down the highway and faded back into the white. He waited for the sound to come again, because he was not yet sure he had heard it at all. It came again. Smaller this time. Wetter. He got out. The cold slapped him clean. He pulled the brim of his charcoal wool cap lower, tucked his chin into the collar of the brown hump canvas jacket that had carried him through 3 different countries, and walked toward the row of industrial dumpsters that the county hadn't hauled away in years. Snow had drifted against the rusted bases. The wind cut sideways between them, sharp with the smell of cold metal and something fainter underneath, something animal, sour, exhausted. A smell that did not belong to a parking lot in winter. A smell that belonged to a barn at the end of a long season. He moved past the first dumpster, past the second, in the narrow shadow behind the third, half buried under a torn blue tarp the wind had. There was a cage, wire mesh, suitcase-sized. A length of rope wrapped twice around the door, knotted clumsily, the way a man knots rope when his hands are not steady. He stood very still. The sound came again, closer now, and underneath it, lower, the patient, slow rhythm of another breath, a larger one. He knelt. The cold bit through the denim at his knees, and he did not notice. He drew the rest of the tarp back, slowly. A golden retriever, so thin and so matted with snow and grime that for half a second he was not sure what he was looking at, lay curled in the back corner of the cage, with 3 small bodies pressed against her belly. The smallest was tucked deep beneath her chin and was not moving. The mother lifted her head slowly and met his eyes and did not growl. She had stopped having the energy for growling somewhere long before this morning. He laid his bare hand on the wire just below her face, not touching. A presence. "Hey, Mama," he said, his voice coming out lower than he had expected. "Hey, it's all right now." He noticed 3 things at once. There was a faint shadow around her neck, the soft, pale line of something that had ridden too tight for too long. There was a brown paper envelope wedged under one of the loops of rope, soaked at the corners but dry at the fold. And there was, underneath the smell of cold metal and exhausted animal, a fainter note he could not yet name. Something chemical, dilute, almost like the inside of a feed barn that had been bleached too often. He tucked the envelope inside his jacket, against his chest. He did not then think about the smell. He only registered it. Behind him, footsteps crunched through the snow. He turned. Silas Brennan, the wiry Irishman who owned the bakery on Cottage Lane, was walking up the gravel shoulder with a black plastic strap dangling from one gloved hand. He stopped when he saw Keanu among the dumpsters. He stopped harder when he saw what Keanu was looking at. "Lord have mercy," he said softly, the lilt of his father's village still in his voice. He set the bag down. "How long have they been there?" "I don't know." "Did you see anything, Silas?" "Thought. Before dawn. Black pickup. No plate. 2 minutes. I was bringing out the morning bread. I thought they were dumping equipment. I didn't look." He took a step closer. He looked into the cage. His face did something that did not have a clean name. "My grandmother kept a dog like this on her farm in Galway," he said, mostly to himself. "Best soul I ever knew." He looked up. "What do you need?" "Help me lift it." They lifted it together. It was heavier than it should have been, which was its own kind of telling, frozen at the base, a small, cruel weight that needed no words. They carried it to the bed of the F-150. Keanu draped an old wool army blanket over the top and tucked the corners down to block the wind. The mother had not made a sound through any of it. By the time the cage was in the truck, the snow was no longer falling. It was coming down. Silas looked at the road climbing toward Eagle Pine Trail and shook his head. You won't make it up the mountain in this. Sheriff keeps the old firehouse open on cottage. Wood stove. Folks keep it stocked, all right. Silas started back toward the highway. Halfway to the road, he stopped and turned. Mr. Reeves. It was the first time he had used the name. Yes, I'll tell anyone who asks I haven't seen you today, if that helps. It does, thank you. The Irishman raised a hand and was gone into the white. The old firehouse on Cottage Lane was a single-story wooden building painted the color of dried brick, with the hand-lettered sign on the side door, Emergency Shelter, Big Bear County Sheriff, wood inside, please replace what you use. Keanu pushed the door open with his shoulder and carried the cage in. The room was cold but still. A wood stove squatted in the corner with a neat stack of split pine beside it and a tin coffee can holding kindling and matches. Above the stove, somebody had tacked a hand-drawn cartoon of a smiling fire engine. Somebody else had hung a small cross-stitched sampler that read, "Bless this mess." On the bench near the door, an old paperback Western lay open face down, where the last person to shelter there had set it before leaving. Somebody had circled a sentence in pencil and never come back to finish the page. He set the cage down close to the stove. He built the fire. His hands knew what to do. Newspaper twisted into loose knots, kindling teepeed over them. A match struck against the side of the box. The first orange tongue of flame caught on a curl of pine bark, and within 10 minutes the iron of the stove had begun to radiate that particular dry heat that no other kind of heating ever quite matched. He worked the rope on the cage loose. He set the door open. He crouched a few feet back. "Whenever you're ready, Mama," he said. She didn't come out. He hadn't expected her to. She watched him for what felt like a long time, then lowered her head and began, very gently, to nose her smallest puppy, the one that had not moved, the one that was still not moving. He reached into the cage with both hands and worked them under the little body. The mother watched but did not protest. He drew the puppy out, cradled against his chest, and brought his face down close. The fur was cold, too cold. He could feel the ribs against his fingers. So small, so light. The whole of the small life, weighing less than the cup of coffee he had left on the dashboard of the truck. He held 2 fingers against the chest and waited. A beat, another. A long pause, another. The heart was there, just, faint and slow. He unbuttoned his flannel shirt halfway down and slid the puppy inside, against the skin of his chest, where the body's own furnace lived. He sat on the floor with his back against the wooden bench, the stove a low, warm hum to his left, and he pulled the front of his jacket, closed over the small bundle. The puppy was so still he could feel his own heartbeat thudding against it like a much larger drum being held against a much smaller one. Sometime in the long quiet, the small body against his chest twitched, then twitched again, then made a sound, a thin, wet, complaining sound. The sound of a creature that had remembered, against all evidence, that it was alive. It was the same sound he had heard from the cab of that truck, the same thin, broken thread. His eyes closed. He let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. "There you go," he whispered. "There you go. That's it. That's the trick." He sat there a long time after. He could feel the heartbeat steady against his own. He could smell the pine sap burning in the stove, and faintly, still, that other smell from the cage, the chemical dilute one, the bleached barn one, coming off the mother's coat in small puffs as she dried in the heat. He remembered the envelope. He drew it out. The paper had dried some against his body. He worked it open carefully and found a single sheet of lined paper, folded twice. The handwriting was a man's, shaky, not the shake of an old hand, but the shake of an unsteady one, the kind that comes from a person who is writing while afraid. To whoever finds them, I tried to do right by her. I couldn't anymore. Please don't let them die. They never had a chance to be anything but cargo. There was no name, no date, no address. He turned the paper over. The back was blank. He folded it again, slid it back into the envelope, and tucked it into the inner pocket of his jacket, against his ribs. "You're not cargo," he said, to the dog, to the room, to the night. "Not anymore." The fire popped softly. Outside, the storm finished sometime around 8. He went out into the new quiet and looked at the world. The mountains had been remade in white. He went back inside, fed 3 more pieces of pine into the stove, more than he had used, swept the small spill of ash, picked up the cage as gently as he could manage, and carried it out to the truck. He drove home through the dark. "Almost home," he said quietly to the cage behind him as he climbed the switchbacks. "Almost home." The cabin appeared around the last bend. The porch light a small yellow square against the snow. The first thing he learned about the mother, in the days that followed, was that she would not eat in front of him. He set out warm rice, softened with shredded chicken, backed all the way across the room, and listened from the kitchen as she ate, slowly, neatly, like a creature who had learned, somewhere, that food could be taken away if one was too eager about it. The puppies were a different problem. The 2 larger ones nursed clumsily. The smallest one was different. He had tried twice and given up both times, exhausted by the effort. By morning, Keanu had bundled the smallest into a clean dish towel inside his jacket and driven down the mountain for goat's milk, because cow's milk was too thin for newborns who had lost the math. In the small independent market at the foot of the road, a silver-haired woman in a maroon wool sweater spoke to him from behind the paperback rack. She was browsing a hardcover and licked the pad of her thumb before turning each page, the way a person who had handled books for 40 years does without thinking. She told him where to find the goats. Her name was Margaret Holloway, Maggie mostly, and she had taught 3rd grade in Big Bear for 38 years and had buried her husband, Walter, a firefighter, going on 8 years ago. She rode up the mountain with him to a herd keeper named Pete Larson. Pete came out of the barn before they had finished parking and walked once around the truck, slowly, with his hands in the pockets of his coveralls. "Don't park crooked next time," he said. "Goats don't like crooked." Maggie made the introduction. Pete considered it. Behind him, an older man with a long grey braid and worn leather gloves had come out of the barn and stopped a few feet behind. Henry Redfeather, 22 years working the goats. He inclined his head once at Keanu without speaking. Keanu returned the gesture. "So," Pete said, "how do I know you're not going to drive that milk down to the valley and let your kids play with the goat?" "I don't have any kids," Keanu said. "I have 1 mother dog and 3 puppies in a cabin on Eagle Pine, the smallest ones inside my jacket because he was too cold to leave behind." Pete looked at him for a long moment. Then Henry Redfeather spoke, slowly. "When an animal chooses you in its weakest moment, that's not luck. That's a debt being paid forward. The only honest answer is to pay it." He nodded once at Keanu. "He's all right, Peter." Pete made a noise in his throat that could have meant anything. He went into the barn and came back with 2 warm gallon jars of raw goat's milk. He charged $15 and would not take more. As Keanu was getting back in the truck, Pete stopped at the door, half-turned. "The little one. Body heat helps the first 3 days, but after that he needs to be with his mama all the time, except for feeding. You hold him too much, his mama stops trying to keep him alive. Animals know what they can afford to love." He went back into the barn. Back at the cabin, Maggie rolled up the sleeves of her sweater and showed him how to use a clean medicine dropper, how to hold the puppy upright, how to put the drop on the side of the tongue. The puppy nursed. The mother watched. The room smelled of wood smoke and goat's milk, and underneath it, the faint sour chemical note from the cage. In the second hour at his kitchen counter, Maggie paused over the small saucepan and lifted her head. "What's that smell?" He had not noticed. He had stopped noticing, within the first day, the way a man stops not the smell of his own kitchen. He looked at the cage where the mother lay drying in the warmth. It came in with her. Maggie did not answer right away. She tested the milk against the back of her wrist. "That is not a smell from any kitchen or any barn I would want a baby raised in," she said. "That is the smell of some place that has been hiding something for too long." He looked at her. She did not look back. She crouched down beside him on the rug. 3 days later, in the evening, after the puppies had eaten and Willow, they had named her Willow because she had bent in the wind and, not broken, was sleeping by the stove with birch and aspen and small cedar curled against her belly. Keanu opened the black leather notebook he kept on the side table and wrote 4 names at the top of a clean page. Then he wrote, underneath them, 3 days. Already feels like a year. He closed the book. He took them down the mountain on the 4th morning to a clinic called Cedarbrook Animal Care, where a red-headed veterinarian named Adelaide Whitmore set Willow on an exam table and worked her hands over the dog without saying anything for nearly 40 minutes. The exam room was small and clean. There was a chipped Folgers can on the shelf beside the sink, holding her pens with the lid still rattling around the bottom, where she had dropped it years ago and never bothered to take out. When she finally stepped back, she dried her hands on a paper towel. "Do you want it long or short?" she asked. "Long." She gave it to him long. 5 letters, maybe 6. A scar tissue line along the lower abdomen that told her there had been at least 1 emergency cesarean done in conditions that were not a clinic. A pale-healed wound at the base of the neck made by a knife, the size and angle of someone cutting out a microchip in a hurry. Teeth worn at the canines in a pattern she had seen 4 times in 8 months. The pattern of a dog who had spent months biting at the bars of a metal cage. All 4 came in from the eastern part of San Bernardino County, she said, specifically a small rural community called Lucerne Valley. He was very still. Under the antiseptic of the exam room, he could smell, faintly, that same sour, bleached barn note coming off Willow's coat. It had not washed all the way out. The smell was not just from the cage. The smell was the place she had come from. "What about the babies?" "The big one's strong. The middle one's fine. The smallest has a mild upper respiratory infection. He's gaining. He'll be smaller than the other 2 all his life, but he'll be all right." She set the clipboard down. She leaned her hip against the counter. "I'm going to ask you a question, Mr. Reeves, and I would like a direct answer. What do you intend to do with this information?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Dr. Whitmore," he said, "I'm involved." She nodded once. She made a phone call. The man who arrived 4 hours later was Maggie's nephew. Theo Holloway was 38, sandy-haired, wire-rimmed glasses. He pushed up his nose every minute or 2, a leather mezzanine bag that had been resoled at the seams. He was a reporter at the San Bernardino Sentinel and had been chasing the same property in Lucerne Valley for 2 years. The property belonged, through 3 layers of holding company, to a man named Roland Kessler, the proprietor of a business called Kessler Premium Kennels, which sold golden retrievers and labradoodles out of a sleek showroom in West Hollywood for $8,000 to $15,000 apiece. No customer was ever permitted to visit the breeding property. Keanu placed the brown paper envelope on the exam table. Theo read the note twice. Adelaide crossed the room to read it over his shoulder. "This is somebody on the inside," Theo said. "Somebody who works on that property right now. The handwriting shakes the way somebody shakes when they're afraid of what they're doing while they're doing it. They use the word cargo because that's the word they hear all day. That word belongs to whoever is in charge." Adelaide studied the page. She made a small, careful sound. "And it is grief, both at once. They saved her life," Keanu said. "And then they didn't tell anybody who they were. which means they're still there. Theo took a long breath. He took out his phone and photographed the letter. He handed the original back. I need to tell you, Kessler doesn't lose Gmallet quietly. I have watched him not lose 2 investigations now. They will look at you and see a man with a target on him, and they will move very carefully, but they will move. I'm not going anywhere. Theo pushed his glasses up. I almost quit this work last year. Drove up to my aunt's cabin for a weekend. On the 4th day, she gave me coffee on her porch, and she said, Theodore, my husband, ran into burning buildings for $40 an hour. He didn't run in for the money. He ran in because somebody had to, and then she went back inside. That was the whole conversation. I didn't quit. Keanu nodded. Then you and I have something in common. In the parking lot on his way back to the truck, a man in a charcoal cashmere coat got out of a black Mercedes SUV holding a Pomeranian in a quilted plaid coat. The dog's collar had a silver tag that read Beldrare. The man's name was Preston Vance. He looked at the cage in the bed of the F-150 and offered, with the practiced smile of a man who knew exactly which circles he moved in, to refer Keanu to a better breeder. None of this rescue project nonsense, if you don't mind my saying so, Preston said. Keanu closed the tailgate. He took one breath. Mr. Vance, papers don't make a soul. They never have. And character, the kind that matters, gets built on cold mornings when nobody is watching. Not in show rings. Preston blinked. Keanu climbed into the cab and drove away. 11 days passed. In those 11 days, Cedar nearly doubled in weight. Willow began to follow Keanu from room to room, lying in the doorway of whatever room he was working in. Once, on the 8th day, he laid a hand absently on the top of her head while he was making coffee, and she pushed her skull up into his palm with a small, steady pressure that stopped him for 10 seconds in the middle of his kitchen, holding the coffee scoop in midair. On the morning of the 12th day, a process server in a green parka came up the trail with a 14-page complaint from Voss and Marston, LLP, Century City. The plaintiff was Kessler Premium Kennels. The defendant was Keanu Reeves. The complaint demanded the return of 1 breeding female and 3 commercial offspring, along with $250,000 in damages. Maggie read it twice and pushed her reading glasses up onto her forehead. 40 years I taught grammar, she said. This document has 3 typos, a misplaced modifier, and 1 sentence fragment that would have lost a 6th grader 2 points on a 5-paragraph essay. A man with this much money should be hiring better lawyers. She gave him the name of a lawyer in San Bernardino, Naomi Bellwether, a former assistant district attorney who had switched to animal welfare law 8 years ago after a horse neglect case broke her heart. They met the next afternoon. Voss will drag this out, Naomi told him. He will file motions on top of motions. He will not succeed. The dogs will stay where they are. The fast part is that he is going to lose his composure within 30 days. He always does. When he does, we will be ready. Theo's first piece in the Sentinel ran the following Tuesday. By Wednesday, the LA Times had picked it up. By Friday, a small online publication of the kind that paid by the click was running a series of pieces under headlines that did not match the facts. By Saturday, 3 paparazzi were parked in a rented SUV at the foot of Pine Knot, watching the road. The town's response was not Keanu's. Silas Brennan parked his bakery van across the SUV's line of sight and read a paperback for 2 hours. Pete Larson and Henry Redfeather came down in a work truck and stood with their arms folded. Frank Kowalski, who had been Walter Holloway's partner on the engine crew for 28 years, organized 3 more pickups across the only exit. The photographers conferred. They left. Keanu walked down to Maggie's cabin when he heard about it. Maggie, I owe these people something I am going to spend the rest of my life figuring out how to repay. She looked at him over her reading glasses. That's not how it works up here, Mr. Reeves. They didn't do it because they expect repayment. They did it because Walter would have done it for any one of them. The accounts are older than you. It was Tuesday when Vivian Crestwood came back. She came up the trail in a silver Range Rover and stood in the middle of his living room and offered him a charity event at her boutique. She told him honestly that the publicity would also be good for her. Her boutique had been struggling. He thanked her for the truth. He asked her instead to write a check in any amount she could give and not put her name on it. She did not say anything for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice had a new edge to it. He stayed level with her. He told her, quietly, that peace was not always at the loudest table, that a flannel shirt and a dog by the fire was where he had happened to find his. She set down the bakery box she had brought unopened. She put on her coat. At the door, without turning around, she said, "You don't know who you've offended, Mr. Reeves." She left. The storm came in 2 nights later. The locals called the worst kind sit-down storms because the air pressure dropped so low that the wind died and the snow came down in still vertical sheets. The power went out at 9:11. Keanu lit kerosene lanterns and built up the fire. Around midnight, Willow lifted her head from where she lay by the stove. She nosed Cedar. She nosed him again more firmly. He did not move. She lifted her head and looked at Keanu. He was beside her in 3 steps. The small body was warm enough on the outside, but the inside was wrong. Breathing shallow, eyes not focusing. He laid the puppy against the skin of his own throat and his cell phone showed no signal. He plugged in the satellite phone Maggie had told him to buy a week earlier and dialed Adelaide's home number. She picked up on the second ring. The connection crackled but held. "Adelaide, it's Keanu. Cedar's gone cold inside." "How long?" "Less than 10 minutes. He nursed an hour ago. The road's closed at the second switchback. I can't get to you tonight." Boil 2-quart bottles of water. Cap them. Wrap them in dish towels. Place one on either side of his body. Mix a teaspoon of sugar into half a cup of warm water. 1/4 milliliter on his tongue, side of the mouth every 5 minutes. Don't stop. I'm going to stay on the line. He did all of it. He did it on his knees on the rug, with Willow lying pressed against his hip and watching her son as though she could will the breath back into him by attention alone. Adelaide stayed on the line. She did not fill the silence with words. Every few minutes she would say, "Still with me," and he would say, "Still here," and that was the whole exchange. It was 2 hours past midnight when the smell came back. He had not noticed it coming. He had been bent over the puppy with the dropper in one hand and the phone against his shoulder, and somewhere in the long quiet between the 3rd and 4th dose of sugar water, it surfaced. The dilute chemical smell, the bleached barn smell, rising off Willow's coat in the heat of the lanterns the way it had risen the first night in the firehouse. He bent low to her flank and breathed it in, and he understood. The cage had been brought to him on purpose. The pull-off he had stopped at was not on the main road. It was a quiet gravel cut that locals used for fishing the creek in summer. A stranger driving up from the valley would not have known it existed. A stranger would have left the cage at the gas station 2 miles back, or in the parking lot of the diner 3 miles farther on, or in any of a dozen places more likely to be seen. The cage had been placed exactly where someone who drove this road regularly might stop, and there was only one stretch of Pine Knot Avenue where mountain locals routinely pulled off in bad weather. That stretch was the one he had stopped at. Whoever had written the note knew the road. Whoever had written the note knew his road. He did not say any of this to Adelaide. He sat with it. At 20 minutes past 2, Cedar opened his eyes. He looked briefly at Keanu. He looked more deliberately at his mother. He made a small, wet, complaining sound, the sound of a creature annoyed at being too warm, and turned his head into Willow's belly and latched on and began, in small, unsteady, determined pulls, to nurse. It was the same sound he had heard from the cab of the truck on the afternoon of the storm, the same thin, broken thread. The third time, it had crossed the line between a sound that asked nothing of him and a sound that asked everything. Keanu put his head down against the rug and did not for a long minute trust himself to lift it back up. "Adelaide," he said into the phone. "I heard him. He's going to be fine. You did good." She hung up. After that, things began to move. Officer Bram Caldwell of the Big Bear substation came up the trail to inspect the dogs at the request of the plaintiff's counsel, and he filed a report stating that the animals were receiving exemplary care and that they would not leave the cabin on his watch. The morning after his report was filed, the tires of Keanu's pickup were deflated at the foot of Maggie's drive, with a note tucked under the windshield wiper that read, "Drop the case. R.K." 2 nights later, somebody broke into Maggie's empty cabin. They did not steal anything. They turned her wedding photograph face down on the side table. They pulled the green afghan that Doris Penberthy had crocheted 40 years earlier off the back of her chair and dropped it on the floor. They left a torn page from a book on the kitchen table with the words "Last Warning" written on the back in cheap ballpoint pen. Maggie did not panic. She turned her wedding photograph carefully right side up, with the words, "My husband does not lie face down in his own house," and she folded the afghan and laid it back across the chair, and she gave permission for Officer Caldwell to call the FBI field office in San Bernardino. The prints on Maggie's kitchen cabinet handles matched a man named Dale Brackett, a known associate of Roland Kessler. That same afternoon, a man walked into the FBI field office voluntarily and asked to speak to the senior agent on the Lucerne Valley breeding case. His name was Marcus Thorne. He had been an employee of Roland Kessler's for 4 years. He said the cage behind the dumpsters had been his. He said the letter inside it was his. Theo drove up to the cabin the same night, with his eyes wider than Keanu had ever seen them. "He picked the spot on purpose," Theo said. Keanu was making coffee. He set the kettle down very carefully on the burner. "What spot?" "The pull-off past the old Sinclair. He drove past Big Bear twice the week before, scouting. He was looking for a place that was off the main road, but that locals would see. Somewhere a stranger would never stop, but somebody who knew the mountain might." He told the agent he sat in the diner across the way for an hour the morning before he came up, drinking the worst coffee of his life, just watching the road. He saw 3 different pickups stop at that pull-off in bad weather. He said, "I needed someone who would stop. I needed someone who wouldn't pretend they hadn't heard it." Keanu did not say anything for a long moment. "Why that pull-off?" Theo pushed his glasses up. "Because he had been watching a small online forum that locals in Big Bear posted on. A neighborhood watch page, the kind every mountain town has. He'd been watching it for a month, looking for someone who fit a particular shape. He saw, in a thread 3 weeks earlier, a post about a man who had pulled over on the highway to help a stranded driver change a tire in a snowstorm, and refused to give his name when the driver tried to thank him. The post said the man drove an old blue Ford F-150 with mismatched tires. The post said he was renting the old cabin on Eagle Pine. Keanu looked at the kettle. He looked back at Theo. "He picked me. He picked the kind of person you were rumored to be. He didn't know it was you. The post hadn't named you. He found out who you were the morning after, when the local paper ran the smaller piece about a man finding abandoned puppies near the Sinclair station. He told the agent that when he saw your name in the paper, he sat in his truck and cried for an hour." "Why?" Theo took a long breath. "Because he was afraid of what would happen if it was someone who couldn't afford to fight back. He had been planning the drop for 2 weeks. He had thought he was sending Willow to a sympathetic neighbor. He found out he had sent her to a man who could survive a lawsuit. He told the agent the relief he felt when he saw the name was the worst feeling he'd had in his life. Because relief, he said, was a thing he hadn't earned." Keanu sat down at the kitchen table. The smell came back faintly in the back of his mind. The bleached barn smell, the smell of a place where 127 dogs lived in cages that had been hidden with chlorine. Someone had carried that cage past a dozen better places, in the dark, in the snow, because somewhere on a small mountain forum a stranger had written about a man who stopped for a tire and would not give his name. The smell was not random. The crying was not random. The road was not random. A man who had been watching for a particular kind of stranger had found one. He had folded a piece of brown paper around a sentence he was afraid to sign, and he had driven up the mountain in the dark, and he had set a cage exactly where a particular kind of stranger was likely to pull over, and he had driven back. And then he had cried for an hour the morning after. "It wasn't luck," Keanu said quietly. "No," Theo said. "It wasn't luck. It was somebody calling for help and being very specific about who they called." The cabin was very quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the cedars, the trial of Kessler Premium Kennels v. Reeves began on a Tuesday morning in the middle of March, in a windowless courtroom on the third floor of the San Bernardino County Courthouse. Theo sat in the front row with his small leather notebook. Maggie sat beside him in a navy dress she had bought for Walter's funeral. Silas Brennan sat directly behind them. Officer Caldwell stood in the back, in plain clothes, off-duty, because he had wanted to be there for the morning. Adelaide Whitmore took the stand first and answered Damien Voss in the same calm clinical voice she had used in her exam room. Silas testified about a black pickup with no plate and a man with a scar through his right eyebrow named Dale Brackett. Marcus Thorne testified about a property in Lucerne Valley that contained 4 breeding barns and what the staff called the back kennels, where 127 adult female dogs lived in conditions the showroom photographs never showed. He testified that Willow had been cage number 42 for 4 years and 4 months and had produced 6 litters before the order came down to dispose of her. He testified that the smell on the dogs from that property was a low-grade chlorine bleach the on-site manager used to keep the cages from being shut down by an inspector. And he testified, when Naomi asked him about the night of January 21st, that he had chosen the pull-off carefully after a week of watching the road. Keanu, at the defense table, did not move. He had known what that smell was since 2 in the morning during a storm on Eagle Pine Trail. He had known since then that the cage had not been left at his pull-off by chance. The trial confirmed only what the smell had already told him. Maggie was the last witness of the day. She talked about Walter for nearly 20 minutes. She talked about the Cedar Fire of 2003 and smoke that had taken 16 years to finish what it had started. And then she looked at the judge and not at Roland Kessler. She had decided weeks ago she would not give him the courtesy of being noticed. And she said, "My husband told me more than once in his life that a life is a life." Mr. Kessler put a price on that dog. Mr. Reeves put a roof over her. That, Your Honor, is the entire difference between the 2 men sitting in this courtroom today. The verdict came down 9 days later. Kessler was found liable on every count. 8 months later, after his lawyers had exhausted every motion that could be made and several that could not, he was sentenced to 4 years in state prison. Dale Brackett pled out for 2. Marcus Thorne received 18 months of probation and was offered a part-time job at a rescue called Second Chance Canine in Riverside. He took it. The Lucerne Valley property was emptied on a Saturday in April. 127 adult dogs and 41 puppies were removed. The land was sold at auction 4 months later, with Keanu paying the reserve price anonymously through a holding company none of the papers traced. By the end of summer, it had become a permanent sanctuary. The sign at the gate, hand-lettered on a board of weathered cedar by Henry Redfeather himself, read simply 42 and the ones who came after. A week after the verdict, Vivian Crestwood came back up the trail. She did not bring a bakery box. She stood in the middle of his living room and apologized for the person she had been when she had said the things she had said. She left a check on the table by the door with no amount written and no name on it. 3 weeks later, the amount written on that check by Keanu, an amount Adelaide would not, for the rest of her life, repeat to anyone, became the founding contribution of an organization the four of them had been quietly designing for 2 months. They called it the Willow Foundation. Adelaide was its medical director, Theo was its director of communications, Maggie was its grandmother in residence. Marcus Thorne, when his probation ended, became its senior volunteer coordinator. The foundation needed a building. Kia bought the old firehouse on Cottage Lane from the sheriff's department at the appraised price. 3 months after the foundation opened, Theo's continuing series caught the attention of a state senator from the Inland Empire. A bill was introduced. 8 months later, it was passed and signed into law. It tightened inspection requirements for commercial breeding facilities, prohibited the sale of puppies under 8 weeks old, and created criminal penalties for the practices that had defined Roland Kessler's business model. The papers called it, informally, the Willow Bill. In late September, Maggie called Keanu and asked him if he would come and speak to the children at Big Bear Elementary School. He said yes immediately. He drove down the mountain on a Wednesday morning in a clean blue flannel shirt with no entourage and no security. The auditorium held about 80 children. He sat down in the small wooden chair set up for him and told them about a cage behind a dumpster on a snowy day, about a mother dog who had been too tired to growl, about a small puppy he had held against his chest in a cold firehouse while a storm came down outside. He did not tell them anything about himself. When he was finished, a small girl in the front row raised her hand. Her name was Lily Marsden. She was 8. "Mr. Keanu, why do people do that to dogs?" He took his time. The room waited. "Some grown-ups," he said, "have forgotten that what something costs is not the same as what it's worth. They learn to count money before they learn to count anything else. And now that's the only kind of counting they know how to do. That's why kids like you matter, sweetheart, because you're learning to count both." A boy near the back asked, "Did you save Willow because you're famous?" "No, buddy. I saved her because I was there. Anybody who's there can save somebody. You just have to look." He thought, as he said it, of a man who had sat in a parked truck across from a diner on Pine Knot Avenue for an hour the week before the storm, watching the road, trying to find the kind of stranger who would stop. A week after that, the schedule arrived. A new film, 6 months in Vancouver, 3 more in Atlanta, 9 months away from California. He walked down to Maggie's porch. He sat in the chair beside hers. He told her about the cabin half a mile down the trail with the 3 bedrooms and the fenced yard and the south-facing porch, that he wanted to buy it for her, for Willow and Birch and Aspen, because Willow did not belong on a film set. Maggie did not respond immediately. When she did, she gave him a single condition. "You sit at my kitchen table whenever you are in town. You call me when you are lonely on a set, even at 3 in the morning. And you tell me before you leave that you will be back. I have buried enough people. I am not interested in burying the idea of a person who is still alive somewhere else." He took hand. "I'll come back. I promise." Cedar came with him. There had never been any question about it. On the morning of his departure, when Keanu set the small dog on the grass with Willow and Birch and Aspen to let them say goodbye, Cedar took 2 steps away from his mother, sat down on the toe of Keanu's boot, and looked up with an expression that was not negotiable. Willow watched him do it. She walked over. She nosed him once gently, the way she had nosed him on the floor of the firehouse the night he had nearly died. Then she turned and walked back to her place by Maggie's chair and lay down. Before he left, Keanu walked into the woods behind the cabin with a small canvas bag of tools. The cedar tree that had fallen in the storm in February still lay where it had fallen, half buried now in the receding snow. He sat down on the trunk. He took out his pocket knife and a clean board he had cut from the tree the week before, sanded smooth, about 2 feet long. He carved 4 names: willow, birch, aspen, cedar. The letters were not perfect. He did not try to fix them. Then, near the bottom of the board, beneath the last name, he carved 1 careful ring. A single circle, closed, the first one. He mounted it on the outside wall of Maggie's new cabin, beats the front door. Maggie stood beside him while he hung it. "Cedar trees," he said, "mark time in rings. Every winter they survive, they add one. I'm going to add one every time I come back. How many do you plan to add, Keanu?" "As many as you have coffee for," she laughed, a small, real, surprised laugh. She put her hand on his arm. "Get going, you'll miss your flight." He did not miss his flight. A Saturday afternoon, in late October, in the sharp, clean light of an autumn sun, Maggie sat on her porch and read a postcard from Vancouver for the 3rd time. The picture on the front showed a snow-covered mountain. The handwriting on the back was small and steady. "Cedar reads lines with me. Says he wants top billing. Tell Willow we'll be home for Thanksgiving. Tell Birch the squeaky toy is in my suitcase, already counted. K." She said hard on the side table. She looked down at Willow at her feet. "You hear that, girl?" she said quietly. "Thanksgiving, he's coming home." Willow lifted her head. She thumped her tail against the porch boards. Twice, slow and deliberate the way she had always done it. Then she lowered her chin to her paws and closed her eyes in the warm autumn sun. And from somewhere down the trail, very faintly, a thin, broken thread of sound came drifting up on the breeze. A half-grown puppy somewhere in the yard, complaining at a brother, crying about a stick. And Maggie tilted her head and smiled and went on with her tea, because she knew now what that sound meant. It did not mean what it had used to mean. It meant a creature alive, being annoyed at the size of its own life. Some sounds find a new owner along the way. The first time they reach you, they ask. The second time they are already answered. The road decides which kind you hear, and the road sometimes is being read by a stranger who has been quietly hoping you would pass.